Hello, innovators. I'm Dustin Miller, PolyInnovator. Today we're talking with James McWalter, experienced startup executive, led teams in fintech, and he's done fitness, AI, market research, climate technologies, and host of the Carbotnic Podcast, a show aiming for the new carbon negative economy. And so it's a long form conversations with experts in clean tech. And he's also currently working on exploring ways to decarbonize the economy at scale using artificial intelligence. It's a whole mouthful there. I love it when I run out of air. That's a perfect sign it's going to be a good show. Thank you for joining me on the Polymath podcast.
Thank you very much, Dustin.
So this is a show by PolyInnovator, so please say hello to the innovators in the audience.
Hello, innovators. Dustin gave a very generous introduction, and yeah, hopefully it'll be a good conversation.
Hello and welcome to the Polymath Podcast. Yeah, I would say so. And so one thing I want to ask you before anything else is, how was your 10K you did for charity?
Yeah, thank you for that. So my family and I, we did a 10-kilometer race about a month ago. My brother, Canada, my two sisters, my mom live in Ireland, and I'm currently living in Puerto Vallarta, Mexico. And for the 10-year anniversary of our father's passing, we decided to do a charity run where we would do a relay race, 10 kilometers each, across Ireland, Mexico, and Vancouver, one after the other. So we did the 50K run between the five of us, and yeah, it was great. We hit our target of raising €10,000 for some charities in Ireland that my father was quite passionate about. And yeah, people were incredibly generous with their time and effort, and it was just a great experience. I personally have not run 10 kilometers in probably 15 years. And so I was very much, I took it easy to start, but I finished in just over an hour, so it was okay.
That's not bad at all. And I'm sure you're probably just laying on the floor afterwards, something like that. You seem very fit, so being able to handle that.
It's funny. I actually had to give a talk about an hour or 45 minutes after that.
Oh, no.
And so I went straight in to give that talk, and that's on YouTube. But I think I held it together just about. So
I'll be looking forward to checking that out. I think it'll be interesting. So we're here to talk about sustainability, entrepreneurship, supply chains, and creating a carbon negative economy, like I mentioned earlier. So one way I like to break the ice is to have you share something about yourself that no one knows about you.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I suppose, in Ireland, we love telling stories, so I won't let this go too long. But something that I was involved in that not a lot of people know. So when I was living in London back about 10 years ago, I part-founded a theatre company called Miscellany Theatre Productions with my roommate, and we brought the show to the Edinburgh Fringe. And at the time, we had got a grant to bring the show there, so the actors had accommodation. And I was working in a sales job at the time in London. But we didn't have enough money for my accommodation. And so I actually reached out to a few friends, and I ended up living with Peter. Now, Peter was a Catholic priest, and he's now a Catholic bishop, fully proper. And so I lived with him and two other priests in a parochial house in Edinburgh for about a month. I was basically going out, working on the show during the day, having dinner with these three priests in the afternoon. I don't think I've told that story for quite a while. So
it's interesting. And so you have to be kind of careful where you tread around the house too, so to speak.
Yeah, honestly, and I was, even at that time, I was a card-carrying atheist, but people were they were incredibly generous with their time, generous with the place. I had my own keys, and I was just coming and going, and nobody minded. And they just, honestly, I think they were living vicariously through somebody who's trying to set up a show. And so, we'd have some good chats.
Yeah, that's lovely. And that's why I was asking that question too, because it's always such interesting stories that come out of it. And plus, if you can answer that question, everything else becomes easy afterwards.
Absolutely.
Too. So one thing before the questions I often ask too is, what was your mindset 5 years ago, and how have you changed since then?
5 years ago, so 2015. That's an interesting year. So that was the year I left my job in New York. I was running sales, targeting quantitative hedge funds, so I was selling data sets to those, and very well paid, very enjoyable, but suit and tie life. And I had decided to go traveling. I already felt that I was a little bit old to go traveling, so I would have been kind of 30, 31 at the time. And a lot of my friends, from my time living in Europe, people go traveling in their early 20s. And so I had never really done that. And so I was like, all right, I want to do this. I was actually supposed to leave in 2014, but I met a woman who's now my wife. So we delayed it for a year so she could come. And so, so when we left at the end of August 2015 to go travel around the world, we started at Burning Man. And then, 18 countries later, we ended up, in Vancouver and then on from there. So in terms of mindset, like at that point, it was very much, I worked at a large company for 8 years. I just wanted to see things, find out what I didn't know about and, live out of a backpack. And so that's where I was then.
Mm-hmm. I love that. And so I know that you speak Spanish pretty well. Hopefully you speak English pretty well. Is there any other languages that you've learned along the way?
Yeah, my wife wouldn't say I speak Spanish particularly well. She is a native Spanish speaker. She grew up in the Bronx, but her mom's Ecuadorian. And I don't really have too many other languages. German probably is actually slightly better for me than Spanish even, after spending so much time in Mexico. The language piece is interesting. As you travel, like a lot of people will say, Thailand, it's super welcome, and it is all those things. But you're never really getting to a certain level of depth because the language gap. And so there's a Westerner trope of like traveling around and like having all these experiences. But I was very conscious that like there's a certain level of experience that's just absent from your access because of the lack of language. Yeah. Nothing fancier than a smattering of German and Spanish.
Okay, bueno. When it comes to languages, I always like to ask, because polyglots are very interesting to me, being able to speak multiple languages and switch between them. And so maybe you're just a budding polyglot.
Yeah, and there's an Irish lad. He's got like the polyglot.com, or his name's like David the Polyglot or something. I can't remember his exact name, but I remember listening to his podcast years ago where he would just come in and the core kind of messaging he would give about learning languages is just practice and being open to being embarrassed. And I think this is Tim Ferriss's approach as well. Just get into situations where you're forced to use the language and don't feel too bad when you mess up, because everybody expects people to mess up. So.
Right. Well, mi padrastro is Mexicano, or for the English speakers, that's my stepdad's Mexican. And so I grew up with Spanish in the world. And it's one of those things that I don't talk about drinking too much, and I don't want to go too much on a tangent, but it's funny. I got relatively drunk one night in my early 20s, and there was these two beautiful Colombian girls, one of which had a boyfriend there, and it was just talking friendly with her, but her friend, her cousin actually was there, and I just remember speaking fluent Spanish because I was not inhibited anymore, so I wasn't nervous about it and was able to just be able to speak it so fluently. So
100%. Nice. And actually was at a German wedding years ago, and a somewhat similar thing happened. So
that's cool. Maybe we'll talk about that next time or something like that. So getting into the questions here, how can we use digital transformation landscape and artificial intelligence to make a change in climate change? Now, that's a loaded question, I know.
Yeah, absolutely. So, digital transformation has become this kind of term of art, for those who are not familiar with it, where you have lots of large companies, large governmental agencies, and so on. And, we've all these kind of cool new tools that everybody has access to today. But anybody who works at those agencies, works at those large companies, no, they're not getting access usually to the coolest new stuff. And so a lot of digital transformation is just bringing all the tools that have already been built and making them more available across large companies and large enterprises. And because that is now a what's regarded as a mission critical element of the future planning for a lot of these companies. Like every Fortune 500 company has some sort of digital transformation team. They're figuring out how to implement these things. They're looking at how to do everything across the company. And when you're looking at how to do everything across the company, and you also have the situation where climate is already here, and it's like the issues around climate change are already here and are rushing up even worse issues. You have this interesting kind of moment where you can actually jump onto some of these digital transformation initiatives and say, hey, there's a climate element to this. Hey, maybe you could do things that don't burn so much carbon. There's a writer called Ben Thompson. He's like, I suppose a bit of a guru now for, analysis around how the internet has changed business. And he talks a lot about these different kind of eras of digital transformation. And so I definitely kind of recommend people checking him out.
You did a really good job answering that question, by the way. That's awesome, because like I said, it was loaded. And I really am fascinated with just what areas could be changed when it comes to digital transformation. So years ago at the place I worked at, I was thinking about how can we be better marketing so we can get more people in, or perhaps this nuclear facilities. They're still using ancient computers to run these facilities. That is an underdeveloped area, and there's plenty of other companies and startups that could definitely make use of all this new stuff that's out here.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's certain elements of old technology is has some advantages, and that's why
Being
it's being
safer.
safer, right? So we were hearing about this massive hack that happened through Russian intelligence, and honestly, like they probably were able to hack things that were probably 5 years old easier than things that were
Mhm.
15 to 20 years old, because there was just fewer entry points to a lot of these kind of forms of technology. And so, I'm a big proponent of like, let's move and get these tools out. But I can also see when you're at an agency where your kind of risk profile is so high, like, people are only going to remember the mistake and nobody's going to really remember, the success that you slightly improved efficiency 10%. Those are the situations where I can definitely see why these things are slowed down. And I suppose like there's a kind of general point about how I think about companies and innovation generally. It's like when you're trying to sell something and you're selling an idea, you're selling a product, are people being driven by fear or hope? And the further you go up in a large organization and the larger the organization, the more fear bound everybody is, because the risk of it not existing is, or the risk if they do something bad, it won't exist. Whereas if they just maintain the status quo, it will continue to exist. And that completely flips when you're talking about small companies, small groups of people. The biggest risk is just not doing anything because nothing exists if you don't put any effort in. And so you're driven by hope. You're trying to build these things. And so one of the aspects of digital transformation and how that landscape is kind of evolving is you're now starting to see these hope-driven companies trying to sell to risk-driven mentality companies. And
Mhm.
the main way you get through that kind of conflict is you got to find a champion at the big risk company who, maybe they're going to leave that company in the next couple of years because they're a bit, frustrated by hitting their head against a wall, similar to how I was at year 8 of being at a big company,
Yeah.
and just find that champion and kind of go from there.
Well, and it seems like there's a lot of call to action moments. I had a guest, Pardeep Sangha, on the show, and he talks about a story where he was in the corporate world and just something clicked. And so I was wanting to ask you too, when did you decide that you had to do something? When did that click for you?
Yeah, I wrote this up recently because I wanted to kind of get it down on paper.
Mhm.
The And also, as you retell these stories, right, they become a little bit more streamlined every time. So I'm sure like this is
Yeah.
even more streamlined. In essence, what happened was I started, I used to be a voracious reader. Then I stopped reading so much. And about 3 years ago, I was like, all right, I'm going to try to read a book a week and just that as a general rule. And some years I make it, some years I don't. But in 2019, I decided to like read a lot of climate books and just kind of get a sense because I had always really accepted, climate change is real, of course, but I hadn't really
Mhm.
emotionally accepted it. Like I wasn't really changing my lifestyle. I'm on flights all the time, all these kind of things, eat a load of meat. And so I started reading a lot of climate books, and one in particular, The Inhospitable Earth or Uninhabitable Earth, by David Foster Wells, I believe his name is, in particular kind of had a profound impact because it was talking about like some terrible things that, like basically we do nothing. The state of the world in 100 years is pretty dramatically bad. This is like the kind of stuff of nightmares. And so that
Yeah.
book may not be 100% correct, right? Like, these are estimates and so on, and models, but at least it changed my mindset. And so that was kind of like sitting in my head. And then I was on this flight from a friend's wedding out in Phuket. We went to Bangkok with my wife and a couple of friends. We had a great old time. My wife and I, we've actually been in 7 different countries in the 7 years we've been together. And so we were always trying to go somewhere fun for New Year's, and lots of flights involved. And basically on the flight back from that party, I was like, oh, I need to actually do something about it. I'm just sitting in the sky, burning fuel. And yeah, I think I need to
Mhm.
be involved in some way around climate.
It's interesting too how it just hit you so hard at that one point because, like you said, you had been aware of it, and even if it is just models and may not happen that particular way, it does get you thinking and it starts making you change your perception as what is possible and what is going to happen if we don't do something now.
And what's interesting about it was I originally was getting angry sitting in that plane. I was actually on my own in this particular flight. I was getting angry about the people around me not doing anything. The initial kind of emotion wasn't like, James, you're not doing enough. It was like, how dare these people around me, like, not do things. And so you immediately have the cognitive dissonance of like, if nobody else is doing anything, well, why am I doing something, right? And so that was part of it. It was like, you know, I believe that this is a big problem, but clearly not enough people are jumping on it to solve it. And so, I've had an incredible fortune to get to the places where I am. I've always worked on products that I hadn't particularly loved that much, but, I was somewhat interested in. So I was like, all right, here's an opportunity to actually, work on something really cool, build something really cool,
Mhm.
and, play a small part in, helping solve the biggest problem facing humanity today.
Yeah, well, I'm sure we're going to touch on a lot of that on some of these later questions. But one thing I wanted to mention there is the idea of like morals and having this bias too. Like we were talking about the cognitive dissonance and just biases in that case. But morals are very interesting because you were talking about how you lived with three priests at one point, and I'm sure the morals from Christianity definitely got shared to you at some point in that time. And I've loved learning from multiple different religions and belief systems around the world. It's a very interesting concept. You actually had in one of your posts, you talked about a book you read, another one that gave you ideas on ethics. I thought I'd bring it up now because that seems interesting, where you go on to explain various examples of how people's lives can be jumbled and how that person acts differently in different circles, almost like context switching in a way. But it's more about coming from their morals. And you feel free to explain this better than I
Yeah,
am or anything
no.
like that. But unity in all areas is the goal that you said. And so, how can we cater ourselves to that?
Yeah, and that's it's a bold claim. So I suppose for the context, I have a bit of a background in academic philosophy. Haven't really engaged with it that much since I left, university, 13,
Mhm.
14 years ago. However, those books, I'll sometimes reread some of the kind of main texts that we kind of engaged in. And I was actually going to do a PhD in moral philosophy, and ended up not. And that's a longer story. But in essence, these things are kind of like ingrained in the back of my head. Like, how do we know what to do, and why do we do those things? How much are driven by social pressures? How much are driven by things from inside? How much are driven from our childhood? All these different kind of elements. And so these are just always things that I'm kind of thinking about in low level ways over time. And I was talking to somebody who is writing a book on the ethics of startup founders. I met him at a digital conference earlier in the year, and we just got talking. And he was like, "Well, how do you do yours?" And I was like, "Well," and again, everything I'm about to say is, I'm sure, not original. These are just kind of the synthesis of other people's ideas. And so, this is not the James McWalter ethical, like theory or anything. But in essence, is like one primary way I think about is what I call kind of purple circle ethics. And so if you think about like a Venn diagram, with a couple different colors, and you have, let's say, one ring is yellow, and that's your family. Another ring is green, and that's your work. And another ring is purple, or not purple, but any other color, blue, and that's your friends, whatever it may be. And we all live in these kind of different kind of bubbles, these different circles, and we're a slightly different person when we're at work, we're a slightly different person when we're at home, we're a slightly different person in all these different contexts. And to me, one
Mhm.
of the really kind of powerful, oh, you brought it up, fantastic. One of the really kind of powerful elements is, how do people kind of cope with the cognitive dissonance when these things are radically different? And like an example I use is, like, you could have somebody who's an incredible, it's a father, to incredible family man, all those kind of things. And every day he goes to work and he figures out ways to addict children to more cigarettes, right? And, in that case, he's got a really, really strong kind of ethical framework that, he can look in the mirror, feel great about every day. The people in his community think he's phenomenal, but he's also potentially causing kind of mass harm to the world. And so to me, there's like these dissonances that kind
Right.
of open up. And so, one of the things I think a lot about is how can you narrow it, and so you can get closer to a purple circle where all those circles kind of overlap. And it's an impossible goal to a certain extent, because these things sometimes are in direct conflict. But it's a way I think of as saying, okay, how can you be a good person and, like, morally good? And I'm not defining what the good is, right? This is the good from your own internal perspective. So I get around some of the issues around subjectivism and so on. But yeah, hopefully that helped.
Yeah, no, it's interesting because it's not about what moral is right or wrong. It's about us like having this idea that our morals can be influenced by different circles and different areas of life, and how, in order for us to be better people, I guess you could say, it's a matter of getting those circles to be overlapped as much as possible. Is that
It
correct?
is. And also just, if you believe such a thing is correct, are you contradicting that in other parts of your life? I suppose that's the main bit. If you say, this is how I should treat my fellow people, and you spend all day long setting up systems where that's impossible, then you've clearly, just within your own ethical framework, contradicted yourself. And so I think it's just to try to find a level of, recognize that, again, there's always going to be these differences in these different spheres, but maybe it might be, worthwhile to kind of examine that and say, oh, am I aligned? The things I do in my
Mhm.
day job aligned with how I act with my family, with my friends, with my community, and so on.
Yeah, it's very interesting. And just, I always ask about principles too before the show, but I stopped getting asking that too much. But what are your principles in life then?
Yeah, that's interesting. So I have a specific set of principles around the company I'm building, which is specifically around kind of climate. I think in general, though, you know, there's a phrase I speak to my wife all the time, which is that like happiness is solving problems for other people, all right? And like if I could kind of encapsulate like my principles, it's in that sentence. It's like, I've tried a lot of hedonism over the years. I've tried a lot of different things, and really the only thing that kind of recurringly brings that positivity back to me is solving problems for other people. And so in general, my principles kind of are encapsulated by that. Hopefully that clarifies.
Yeah. And so it's interesting too, because my personal principle is balance. And so I want to find the balance in many different areas. And I just try to apply that in the most like covering manners possible. And I wonder if there's a way of trying to balance morals and get that purple unity circle through that mindset or something like that.
I think, the balance is interesting. I think a lot of it is similar to what I said earlier. It's just actually just recognizing that there's a thing happening here in the first place. Like there is actually a ethical framework occurring. We are doing these things. I think this is like the real power of philosophy, which is to just say what is like, just to recognize certain things are happening. And that's like your first step before you want to even change anything or make any sort of, and then to your point on balance, right? Like, let's say your life is out of balance. You're a workaholic, you're, having too many pints with the lads down the pub, all that kind of thing. And, you want to get healthier, right? Like to rebalance that, you have to recognize the behaviors that are actually causing the imbalance or however you're defining that imbalance. And so to me, it's just like a lot of it's just recognizing where the issue is, and then you can figure out how to solve it.
Right. And I often just, before I move on, just want to mention too, that sometimes there's external pressures. Like we had this year, the whole supply chain in the world and all of our personal lives have gotten impacted through what happened, the pandemic and whatnot. And so I just thought that was interesting how external factors can make a big difference.
Absolutely. And, I think a lot of people are familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where you have this kind of little, pyramid and like, food and shelters at the bottom, and then you kind of move all the way up to like self-actualization. And I think a lot of conversations, don't use that framework to kind of, to like enough to kind of make sure that people are understanding where they're coming from. And so, we've had this situation with COVID, which has been, horrific, right, for so many people, and like this net negative for the entire world. And yet, depending on where you're sitting in Maslow's hierarchy of needs, it could have been one of your best years ever, right? And honestly, like my wife and I have talked about this. If we look back over the course of this year, we're supposed to actually have our wedding, and we never had the wedding. And like these things happen. We have to say, like, this is generally like a pretty good year for us personally, even though all around us, chaos is happening. That's because like we had all the lower levels of the hierarchy already taken care of. We've great place to live, we're safe, all those kind of things where, people right. around us are healthy, we have great support networks. And so, we're very fortunate in that way, but like a lot of people don't have that. And so those external pressures, when they come along, make things very, very desperate for people. And so a lot of how I'm thinking is like, oh, how can you, make some of the kind of minimal standards like available so that people can move up that hierarchy and have more things available to them.
Right. That's definitely something very interesting we've talked about on the show too, but you actually host the show Carbotnic Podcast, and I'm saying that correct, right?
Correct. You are saying that correctly. Yeah.
Okay. And so what have you learned from the show?
What I learned from the show? Yeah. So I actually started the podcast to learn more about CleanTech because I wanted to build something in the space, but I hadn't really done anything in that space before. So I looked at what's the quickest way to learn about CleanTech. And I was like, well, I could join another company. I could do a master's, I guess. But I was like, well, I listened to loads of podcasts, and so I was like, well, just like interview, 20, 30 people. And like, that's a good, and I think I'm sure you found, Dustin, like the education you're getting from like these long conversations is amazing, right?
Like you.
Right, there exactly. You go. And so that was the original prompt to kind of get into it. And it just went great. Like I learned so much about people. And so I'm very selective around the kind of people that, that we talk to. I have a producer who works with me and finds guests and so on. And, as in a way, like, it's an extension of my own interests, right? Like I was pretty broad around clean tech, and now I'm particularly interested in food and fashion and like sustainable supply chains and those kind of things. So the type of person that I'm talking to might have narrowed slightly, but the similarities across people is remarkable. Like I'm mostly talking to clean tech founders. Sometimes I'm talking to investors in early clean tech companies. And it is really remarkable, like, how, I suppose one thing that comes up a lot is people who may not have done anything in sustainable, living or anything like that. They all had some connection to nature as children. They would talk about, I used to go sailing, I was a Boy Scout or whatever it may be. And those things like are kind of like lying dormant often, and you go through an entire career sometimes, and then they peak up right now when there is this massive need to be involved in climate and so on. And so quite a few people had that kind of common thread, which I found quite interesting.
Yeah, finding common threads is definitely very peculiar because you never expect them. You never see them coming, and then when they hit you, they're like, "Oh, that makes a lot of sense." Like spending a lot of time in nature to make them more earthly bound. So to speak.
And what are some common threads that you found, I guess, in your interviews?
Yeah. So I interview a lot of multidisciplinary people, and I realized that it's more common than I even originally thought. Because I was kind of picky, like you, like where I was like, I'm trying to figure out, like, I just want to interview polymaths and people who are very multidisciplinary. And then I realized, well, entrepreneurs are very multidisciplinary, have to wear many hats. There's a lot of people who might be multipotentialites, so they're multi-interested. They have a lot of potential to do many different things, but they may not have done very many things just yet. And so I found that was a lot more common. And one thing I've recently seen that there's a lot of people with ADHD who are multidisciplinary, and oftentimes people who just have a lot of interests and curious about different areas may be diagnosed with ADHD. And I thought that was kind of curious too.
That's very interesting. The curiosity piece, like, definitely makes a lot of sense to me. And actually, there's this famous TED talk. I know TED has become kind of a punchline, but there was one of the most famous, or the most kind of watched, was this gentleman talking about, the state of education, this English gentleman. And in one of the part of the talk, he's talking about how there's a young girl. She was brought in to be checked for ADHD because she's always fidgeting, and they basically just, like, the psychiatrist, like, she was a great psychiatrist, like, looked at the child and was like, no, this child's not there's nothing wrong with her. She just wants to be a dancer, and she became like one of the greatest kind of ballerinas in the world, a number of years later. And so a lot of, I think, this kind of translation of ADHD, fidgeting, and again, ADHD, I definitely accept as like 100% a real thing, but definitely overdiagnosed, I would say. And a lot of it's just because we don't really encourage curiosity. We don't really encourage like the jumping between concepts, and then we try to find founders in their mid-20s, and there's like only 2% or 5% of people actually want to found things because we've beaten the in some ways the creativity out of them.
Right. I'm surprised I didn't even say curiosity is first and foremost thing. It's been the biggest theme out of everybody. And so, because like you had curiosity about climate change, for example, and that drove you to do what you're doing here. And so, yeah, that's definitely a very good point there, James.
Yep.
And so what are some areas of interest that you think needs the most attention in this kind of these fields of yours?
Yeah. I mean, I would say like one of the exciting and like terrifying thing about climate overall, especially from like an innovation point of view, is that it is everything, right? Like,
yeah,
the entire economy is affected by climate change. And so to me, I think that is a way to generate a lot of excitement with people as well. So what I say to people is like, look, what's your favorite thing in the world? And they'll be like, I like surfing, or I like building software for marketplace, for marketing software. And I was like, every one of those things have a climate angle. You can go pick anything you currently enjoy doing and say, how do I either decarbonize using this, or, build an ecosystem that like non-carbonizing or lower carbon kind of technologies can flourish, and kind of go off there. There's a friend of mine, he actually had found a previous company that helps companies more easily manage the perks that they give employees, and now he's working on a climate angle with that. He's finished with that company, and he basically just started a brand new company that's just doing that from a climate angle. There are so many apps, and like people are jumping all over to get involved in this company, and they're about to launch the first product next month. And so to me, there's so many opportunities, and I think a lot of it is just like have that reset and say, hey, how can I help, and then like commit to helping, and then just pick a date and go from there, and just. You don't have to be a scientist. You don't have to be something super, specific. You can just like work on the things you already like doing.
Well, and I think a lot of more kind of stale thought companies where they're not wanting to change as much are afraid of the expenditure of it, so to speak. But I don't think it's actually going to be, it's going to be a decent penny, I guess you could say, but I don't think it's actually that much more or if not less than what it's going to cost us in the long run, not only just environmentally, but even financially. Well, if we keep going down this path, the alternatives are not going to be good, and they're not going to be very cheap either. And so it's better to invest in ourselves now, like getting solar panels or something like that, instead of having to pay for a lot more expensive electricity down the line. Just for example.
100%. But even solar panels are interesting. Like solar panels are now the cheapest form of electricity in the world. Like, 10 years ago, that was not the case. There was actually, it's a very similar curve to how computing power has become cheaper. Moore's law is what's called in computing, for solar panels and renewable energy in general. I can't remember the exact name for it, but it's had a very similar trajectory in terms of cheapness. And so the solar panels that are coming out of a factory today is the cheapest form of electricity in the world if you're going to build a new plant. But we're still building a coal plant every 2 weeks, I think, somewhere in the world, like mostly in South Asia, in various places. And so it's like, there's clearly a disconnect between where we are with technology and price in some parts of the world and where we are actually deploying these things. And I can't remember who said it. It's often quoted, but the future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed.
Yeah.
There are technologies that, for anybody who's traveled a bit, you see things that like are already the lived life of many people, and they're completely brand new kind of magical things in other countries. Like Venmo is super impressive in the United States, but like they've been using text-based payment platforms in sub-Saharan Africa for 20 years because it's just like the best place to start that. So.
Well, and it's interesting too because when it comes to like photovoltaic cells and the solar panels, those have definitely been changing a lot over the years. But Myanmar, I think, is a good example where Facebook, they didn't have internet over there, really. They didn't have like access to the internet. There wasn't enough sources. And so Facebook did something about that and actually moved over there some internet resources, I guess you could say. And because of that, Facebook and the internet are almost synonymous to the people of Myanmar because they don't know anything different. Like you're saying, they're like you said, there's certain parts of the world that are not necessarily feeling the same thing that we are. And it's just interesting how that develops.
And if you want to like contact somebody in Mexico, like it's WhatsApp or Facebook Messenger. People don't have websites. They're using a Facebook company page, and they have a WhatsApp phone number there, and that's because they're free, right? Which is it's always the best price in many cases.
100%. And so one thing that's part of your show is a lot of supply chains when it comes to any kind of field, like we were mentioning before. So what are some of the weak links you've noticed in supply chains? And that's just in general.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Like you mentioned earlier, the context of COVID, I don't think anybody really cared about supply chains in terms of common conversation until, March 18th of this year or whatever it may be. And that, I think, as that kind of general awareness of supply chains has risen, so did my interest in finding these things out, because I was in the exact same place as everybody else last March. How did this stuff get to our homes, and so on. And so there is an aspect of supply chains where you had what they call just-in-time supply chains, where a grain of rice is going to get to every stage to end up in the nice Indian restaurant in downtown Manhattan on a specific day 2.5 days later. And there are probably 50 organizations and maybe thousands of people who were involved with that grain of rice to get it to that plate. And what we found with COVID and what we've seen is that any sort of weak links in that chain are massively disruptive. And so there was an incredible amount of risk inherent in the kind of the supply chain system. You also have this concept that's kind of grown up over the last, let's say, 10 years called the circular economy. And the concept of circular economy is basically, instead of a supply chain, you basically have a closed loop where the inputs at the beginning end up going back into, back to its origin. And so like a classic example would be something like, in a small kind of local farm, you have, you grow some corn, the cow eats the corn, poops the corn, and now you use the cow poop to regrow the corn, right? That's a circular economy in a very simple manner. There are a lot of innovators who are working on figuring out ways to scale that up. And one of the most interesting companies I talked to, on the podcast is a company called Tyson Biosciences. And what they've done, and they're brand new, they're only out a couple of years, but what they've done is developed like a biotech technology where you can take old clothes, you can take t-shirts, you can take anything made of cotton or polycotton blends, send them through their process, and then reconstitute them as fibers that can be respun into t-shirts. And so you basically have a closed loop. So all of these fast fashion clothes that we're all wearing, the t-shirt's probably $5 like everybody else's. Instead of those, after we grow out of them or they get a hole or we just throw them in the landfill, they can take them and just make a new t-shirt out of it. and you basically just keep doing that. And if you use the process, if the process is fueled using renewable energy, it's a completely closed system that's not producing any carbon whatsoever. And so that is incredibly exciting. They're working with Patagonia, who's really kind of an innovator from the enterprise side in this space, to kind of get some of this stuff to scale. And so those are the areas I'm really excited by, like moving from a kind of just-in-time supply chain model to a lot of circular economies based around specific products and how they interlink as well.
Yeah, I was actually going to ask you about fast fashion, but I didn't find a way to mention it earlier. And so that is interesting how that would be a great solvent for a lot of the problems that fast fashion may cause. But it is something that also has been increasing in a positive way, but just not so much in the carbon way. And blockchain. I was curious to see how that decentralized mindset that blockchain employs would be effective in the supply chain market. Because a lot right now it's very centralized. There's like different city hubs that reach out to different places. If we could decentralize which places are getting what inputs and outputs are switching around, basically, you no longer have to only get it from New York. You could also get it from Shanghai if you like, or something like that, which we sort of have, but it's very centralized.
Yeah. So I have a couple of views on blockchain. Which are may or may not be like going against the kind of prevailing. So I think blockchain is a phenomenal technology for digital goods. And so, we have Bitcoin, which is digital good, digital currency of sorts. For physical goods, the value of the blockchain in terms of like figuring out exactly where something is and having a unique identifier for that, and then, tracking that, I think it breaks down in a couple of different ways that are somewhat technical. And so what I find really interesting is blockchains and similar use cases used for basically, in essence, currencies that sit on top of the supply chain. So there's a cool company called Bext, BEXT 360. I also have them on the podcast, but they are looking at, they actually deployed, they've been around for a few years, but they're using blockchain technology to tokenize supply chains today, mainly from developing world countries, coffee, cocoa beans, and all that kind of thing. And honestly, my personal view on like that exact use of blockchain is probably overkill. Like a unique identifier might do the same thing. But where I think their innovation is really fascinating is they're using that as a stepping stone to build, like a green economy or a green financial system on top of that, so that if you are a grower of the cocoa beans at the end, and you've produced the cocoa bean, you can actually tokenize that, make that a unit of currency that can then be traded, and basically it allows people to have access to things like credit and all this kind of thing in a way that's kind of new and unique. And so I think there's a lot of innovation with blockchain. I think the blockchain 0 or 1.0 that was very, very hot about 7 years ago, very few cool companies have come out of that. Coinbase is one exception. I think they're about to IPO, or they've just filed to IPO. So that'll be a good exit for people who are big believers in blockchain. But I think, actually on the decentralized point, I think like decentralization, like as a general rule, I think is a positive move. And again, we've seen that in the case of the supply chains for COVID, these very centralized locus points, when they break, you have massive problems. And so what you really want to have is, instead of 3 large companies doing everything in a field, you have 30 competing against each other, very decentralized, so that if one goes down, you still have supply.
Yeah, that's kind of the point I was trying to dive home with. And my blockchain knowledge only really stems from the blockchain social networks like DTube or Hive, which are more like a Reddit medium hybrid. And so it's one of those things where I've seen the currency be like an influence, so to speak, like you're mentioning with the coffee beans. And so my knowledge is limited. I just wanted to ask you too, because I thought that'd be kind of interesting, like you said, with the whole supply chain, breaking it down more, making it have more options.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And again, like I don't want to be too negative on blockchain as a whole. Like I think is there
You were pretty positive too.
It's just interesting. Like some technologies get evangelists, like really strong evangelists. And like you don't really have an evangelist for SQL, like a SQL database, right? But you have evangelists for blockchain in a very serious way. And I think it's quite interesting how some types of technology get that emotional connection and some don't. Like people who are Apple people versus Windows people in like the early 2000s. Like that's another example where people like really connected their identity to a piece of technology. So I do find it interesting, and it's hard to predict, I think, when that arises, but when it does, those are very strong kind of emotional connections.
Yeah, and definitely blockchain had a lot of hurdles, because there was a lot of companies that were coming up that were almost fake in a way, but there was also some good ones that you mentioned, but very far and few in between. But moving on a little bit, because we're talking about supply chain, where do you see things like 3D printing, such as with food or clothes, coming into the fold?
There's a lot of cool technologies that are already either developed or just figuring out how to get a product that scales. 3D printing was something that I was actually personally very interested in about 9 years ago, like very early days. I actually registered a domain for a 3D printing online marketplace. I only spent about 2 weeks playing around with it, and I didn't do anything with it in the end. But at that time, if you'd asked me, I would have said, everybody would have a 3D printer. It would be the equivalent of having, a drill in your home, like somewhere. And that clearly hasn't been the case. Where I think 3D printing has really kind of excelled is in very specific kind of industrial manufacturing and sometimes even agricultural practices. And so I think those, those are a little bit behind the scenes from people. And so I think there's a lot of cool things happening there. One use case of 3D printing that I heard about quite recently, which I'm very excited by, is combining 3D printing with things like cellular meat. So, people have heard, I'm sure, about the $10,000 burger where it's stem cell, meat and so on. That burger is down to, I think, $10 or $12 now. So the cost curve has calmed down massively. But one of the elements with cellular meat, which is fantastic, is that, no cruelty, vastly smaller carbon footprint, all those kind of things. But the real difficulty is how do you actually make it taste, like not just taste, sorry, the taste is easy, relatively speaking, but how does the mouth feel? Does it taste like, does it feel like steak? Does it feel like something else?
The senses.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like, how does it, when you chew on it, like, does it have that springiness, all this kind of thing? And so they started with, burgers, because burgers are ground beef and they're kind of, mushy before you cook them and all that.
Yeah.
But they've now developed 3D printing of steaks and some cool things like that. And I was talking to, Jaleen, who's one of the co-founders of Future Fields, which is a cool company in the cellular ag space recently. And she was like, in her view, within 5 years, you're going to have desktop 3D printing machines just producing, steaks in kitchens. Now, 5 years is probably a little bit kind of ambitious, but that could well be something. And if you did have something like that, that completely disrupts the entire supply chain, because at that point, you're just delivering, in essence, little packets of stem cells, which then get made at the home. And so I'm personally not sure whether like the likelihood of that happening, but I think it is kind of interesting of how disruptive something like that would be.
That's why I asked that question. So I figured that would be interesting to see, because regardless if you're wanting a meat alternative or just another way of having a source of food, because like you said, the supply chain, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, many people weren't able to afford rent or get enough food. If you had a printer, it may be much easier to deliver those stem cells than deliver cans of food, for example. And so that would be very interesting how that changes.
Absolutely. And then the another kind of technology that I think is really interesting in the farming food space is vertical farming of various types. So, this is the opportunity to have farming within, cities where you have like a big tall building and you have loads of farms in there. It's a very, I suppose, industrialized form of farming insofar as you have to use things like hydroponics and things like that. But you can produce a huge amount of food on a very small footprint of land. And so, if those technologies get the scale and get the popularity and get the price parity to like normal food on your shelves, you could well see like a real disruption of the food supply chains and food in general. But again, I think some of those are much more difficult. They're more difficult to actually get to scale than they seem. So.
Well, and not just scale, but just at this particular time, shifting people's thoughts more than anything. And a great podcast like yours helps do that. And just real quick, one of my main goals with PolyInnovator is actually eventually to work in smart city development. And so I wanted to work in this kind of holistic view of viewing, how do I get that supply chain from this place to this place? How can I help this particular endeavor work with this particular group or something like that?
Yeah, I think like smart city are super kind of fascinating. In another world, like I would have kind of gone full urbanist. Actually, my best kind of friend, he's involved with the city of New York, and he's helping, harden and strengthen the city in advance of climate. And a lot of what he does is just try to figure out how to make the city smarter, how to, deploy IoT devices, how to understand the flow of people, make sure that we have the things we need in the places that they need to. A city, particularly a large city, is kind of like a just-in-time supply chain in and of itself, because you have products coming in and then people are consuming them and it's kind of moving through, especially again when you're talking about a city over 1 million people. Like these are incredibly complex systems that take a lot of thought for how to change them, because I'm sure you know more about this than I do, but if you add certain kind of regulations in certain parts of a city, there's a lot of unintended consequences often kind of come up. And so I'm like density obsessed. Like I think density is God, right? Like I'm very pro density where possible. And so,
Yeah.
if I had a magic wand, I would just like wave a wand and have no height restrictions on pretty much any downtown city in any world. But that's not my rule. So.
Well, I know that some of the reasons why we have the height regulation is purely because of just the safety of because I saw a video actually on TikTok of all things where someone's apartment was so high up that the wind actually makes the whole building move, just the wind, and you can hear it creak and you can feel it move when you're living in there. I thought that's an insane situation there, and part of that might just be it was an older building or just how the literal laws of physics work at that height. But I do agree that density is very key. I hate urban sprawl, and the U.S. has been very bad about that, actually.
Yeah, and it's funny. Like even you could sometimes like rural sprawl can sometimes be pretty bad as well. So in Ireland, we basically the idea of like a small village, small town, right? You'd have a church, you'd have a pub, you have a little shop, right? And then you could have like a little farming community go around that. That's where I basically grew up in Ireland, a place called Garrymore. And
with the wee little
goat. No, we'd cattle, mostly sheep, cattle. We'd pigs one year, and a load of chickens, kind of thing.
Maybe it was
yeah. I was holding a lamb. It was in that photo. It's funny. I have very few photos from that time in my life, and so I was talking to my mom the other day. I was like, as I'm working more in agriculture and that, it's like I try to, where's my farming bona fides, and like there's only like 3 photos from back then.
Man, that sucks. But it was kind of interesting because I was watching one of the interviews you were on. I think it popped up on there, something like that. And you were talking about as a teen, whatnot, you were able to be in that natural environment. Like you mentioned earlier, a lot of your guests had that natural inclination or naturalistic intelligence from a young age. And so it's interesting. And one other thing is like those hamlets, like you mentioned, the rural sprawl, and how even though there's urban sprawl spreading out, outside of those, there's some little hamlets and villages and stuff like that. And hopefully we can make people more and more dense. Part of that was actually because in the US, at least, it was about how far can you walk in between different places. And I think the average was like 7 days or something like that, like a week or so. That's how far each place was from the last.
Yeah, I suppose I should clarify. Like, I think little towns and villages are completely fine. The problem in Ireland is where you have just like rows of houses, like just semi-connecting these little towns and villages, and because you never get a little bit of density, even if the total population size is small, like a couple hundred people, but if it's not walkable and everyone's driving, you all of a sudden have this kind of weird suburban lifestyle, like in the middle of a beautiful kind of countryside of Ireland, and you just have lots of rows of houses just kind of going along. So yeah, that's more kind of what I meant.
Yeah, no, I totally understand. I was just kind of explaining it in a different way, but moving on a little bit here, when you reached out, you actually mentioned you have been quite the jack of all trades, which is perfect for the show. You've built companies, farmed, and even was nearly an academic philosopher, like you were mentioning earlier, the PhD, and more. So how have you managed your multidisciplinary life?
Yeah, it's interesting. Like, I think a lot in terms of like structure. I'm very much like always trying to think through what is a structure that can be put in place to make things easier for myself. I think structure gives the freedom to have unstructured elements like elsewhere in your life. So, I've an incredibly structured day. Like every day is incredibly structured. By 9 a.m., I've gone to the gym, I've walked the dog, I've probably eaten twice, I've done a couple other things, right? And so by 9 a.m., like I've been up 3.5 hours and like I am good to go. And no matter basically what happens the rest of the day, it's already been a good day because so much has been kind of achieved by then. And again, that wasn't always the case. Like these are things I've only implemented in the last few years. And so, but that structure, that like scaffolding that allows the freedom to then be like, okay, I don't have anything to worry about for the rest of the day. All my kind of physical needs have been taken care of, well fed, all those kind of things. And so now it's just about like, can I hit specific targets? And I think there's and this kind of goes back to the kind of conversation around climate. A lot of people are struggling to move into these areas because there's a lack of containers, lack of structures that make a lot of sense. We grew up in a world, and that's obviously changing quite rapidly. But you went to school, you went to high school, you either got a trade or you went to university, or maybe you got a job at the local shop, whatever it may be. Then you get promoted, and then you retire at 65. All of that is being torn apart. People change careers. People change, their views. People change, their industries, 3, 5, 10 times across their entire career. And so in that context, it doesn't really make sense to try to like really promote people to try to go on the old way, just because, And honestly, like I would ask anybody who doesn't want to be a specific, type of job, like a doctor or a lawyer, like, do you really need to be in university right now? Is there a better way to get to the point that you need to? And again, I went to university, a big fan of it, but I think people should really think carefully about whether that's the best for what they are, because universities were designed for a type of world that we're no longer in. And so because we have all this breakdown, you have to kind of try to create as many structures or as many containers, or try to find containers that you can sit in that allows you to kind of explore these other parts of your life. So anyways, hopefully that made sense.
It was perfect. One of my skills that I've been working on for self-development is active listening. From the beginning of these interviews, I told myself that I'm not going to interrupt these awesome guests for coming on. I'm a talker. I had such a hard time not interjecting there because there's so many great topics to go off of there. And I will say that, like, yes, if you feel like you need to go to degree, like you want to become a doctor or some kind of hyper specialist in some shape or form, go ahead and do it. But most people don't have that self-awareness at a young age. Especially in the US, like, we're forcing people to decide this is what you're going to do for the rest of your life, quote unquote. But one thing that was very important that you mentioned there is that over our lifetime, we are changing careers. Even if you stay in the same company, you're changing careers within that company. And so it's interesting how you become polymathic by the end of your life anyways. Why don't we just try to plan that out ahead of time? And so I definitely do agree that there's definitely a lot of choice that's needed there. And containers is a very interesting way of putting it. I've been working on a modular degree system where people can create their own containers for education using online resources. And so I think that's a very interesting way of explaining it.
Yeah, and it's on my word. A friend of mine, she came up with it, and because she's trying to move careers from a venture-backed, she's involved in VC, and she wants to kind of potentially either move into climate VC or something similar. And she was also saying there's just these lack of containers that were very clear to her. One thing that is interesting about this kind of modular form of education, I was like talking to a friend recently about like redesigning high school. Like, how could you redesign high school to actually give people the skills they need today? And what we came up with was, and again, this won't work for every subject, but the idea of like a hackathon where you're actually building and creating and launching something every week, ideally. And so imagine as a classroom, like, you're in your accounting course, or you're in your geography course or something, and you basically, as a class with your teacher, figure out, we're going to solve a specific problem, even if it's very small. We're going to build that, and we're going to get it out there in the world. It doesn't have to be software based. It could be pretty much anything. But we're going to get that out in the world. So we decide the problem we're going to solve on Monday. We build Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and we launch on Friday. And you just do that every week. And you can imagine like the skills that people are building in that mindset, like how they're exploring their own kind of abilities and so on.
The biggest thing that most people suffer from is the lack of completion or execution. That's the biggest thing. So if you can do project-based learning, like you're saying, at a hackathon, that is a great way. That's why a lot of MOOCs do capstone projects at the end, so that you have something to do with that knowledge. And so, yeah, I definitely agree. That's a great way of going about it. You'll have to introduce me to your friend mentioning containers, by the way.
Absolutely.
Well, and another thing you made me think of is that I was interviewing Ali Abdal, a YouTuber. He brought up the idea of a third door. There's always a third door opportunity. So if university is not your option or trade's not your option, what is the third door? Like, what is that other opportunity that you may not be seeing right now that could be better for you?
Yeah, that's definitely interesting. I think the a similar kind of concept, but like that's used in different ways, is Peter Thiel's kind of concept of like, what's your 5-year plan, and then how do you get there in 6 months? And once you start thinking in those frameworks, you're like, like, it's interesting. He says 5 years, and again, Peter has a lot of ups and downs that I don't fully agree with. But the idea of 5 years, I mean, most degrees are 3 or 4 years, and then it takes you a year to get somewhere, and so on. It's like, let's say you wanted to be a data scientist, or let's say you wanted to, someday be a manager of a sales team, or whatever it may be. A lot of companies still ask you to have the 4-year degree just to interview and so on. But the last company I was at before this project was a company called Respondent. So we were about a 30-person company. I was leading up a couple of different parts of the company at the time. And, Jack, the CEO, and some of the founders, and myself, and a couple of the other kind of team leads, we decided basically that we weren't going to request university degrees from any kind of job posting. And we were like fast growing, there's a lot of kind of opportunities, coming up. And I was doing some hiring myself, and, I wouldn't even kind of glance at whether they had degree. And I was like it was actually, to be honest, like it was slightly a negative they had a degree, because I was so trying to find people without college degrees. And I would say two of the best people in that company, don't have college degrees, are moving up through the ranks, and a lot of that's because they're learning on the job, they're figuring things out, and they have that kind of curiosity.
Yeah. Was that Hale?
No, this is Respondent. So it's a Respondent. I was employee 10 at Respondent, but Hale was an older company that I founded with my brother. So.
Okay, sorry for the confusion there. But so can you tell me more about Hale?
Yeah, absolutely. So Hale was a two-sided marketplace for personal trainers. I think, Dustin, you're a trainer, so you probably have some insights here. But and my brother is a personal trainer living up in Vancouver, Canada. And he basically, I was traveling around Asia, as I mentioned earlier. It was kind of end of 2015, early 2016. My brother pitched this idea to build this marketplace that would be driven by an iOS app. And so we started talking about this. I thought, yeah, this sounds great. He has that domain knowledge. I've been involved in technology companies. And then we found a third person, also based in Vancouver, Peter, who was an amazing developer. And so the three of us decided, let's build this thing. And we basically spent about, I'd say, 18 months on it. And we just made a lot of the kind of early first founder mistakes, I would say. We built more products than the market could bear. We, kind of chopped and changed a little bit. And honestly, my brother and I, we were probably not the best people to start a company together. And, I've talked to a lot of people who have started companies with family members, and it's a mixed bag. Some people think it was, amazing thing, and some people struggle like we did. And we learned a lot about each other. It was not there was definitely some kind of amazing highs. Like there was the first time you build something and launch something, even if it's small, with your brother, like that's an amazing positive emotional thing. But then later, when we weren't getting to the stages we wanted to, and there was both of us were kind of not really listening to the other in terms of the commitment that we were kind of
too much tension and whatnot.
And then we were starting to bring in aspects of our relationship that were outside of the company. And so we're very close people, and we've exchanged 5 voicemails just today, on different things, and so we're back stronger than ever. But I think it is something that people should really consider. And so, I'm open.
Yeah, good lesson.
Yeah, and I'm open to co-founders with my current setup. And but I have a very specific view on what that kind of co-founder relationship is. It's not really a friendship. It's not quite a relation. It's kind of this tricky thing to try and balance. So.
Yeah, well, and it seems like there's a lot of people with ideas and not enough techie people to build it and that kind of thing too. So finding people who balance out what you're good at and what you're not good at, and getting the weak points of your chain set up too.
Yeah, absolutely. And for this project, I've learned to code so that I can do certain things on my own. I'm so slow. It's quite frustrating, right? When I was used to have a team, I'd be like, oh, let's do this thing, and they'd just build it. It was so great. And now I'm trying to figure out random Python libraries, but yeah, it's all part of it.
Well, maybe hit me up afterwards, because I definitely did a lot of research into coding. I've tried to learn to code 4 or 5 times in my life recently, actually, because I had a really big issue with my website that I was working on. And so I had to learn it again. But there's a lot of Python libraries that I had found over the years. And so maybe I might have something to help. Can you tell me more about your current startup?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's currently titled WolfD, but that probably will have a name change imminently. I bought a couple of domains today, so I might be changing it over the holidays. And in essence, what I'm looking to do is measure carbon at scale to help food supply chains decarbonize. Basically, the situation we're in right today is that the food that people eat every day, the box of cereal, all those kind of things, there's an incredible amount of carbon burnt just to get that box of cereal to your shelves. And interestingly, it's not because of the truck that brings it there. It's not because of the packaging, although those things have an effect. The vast majority of the carbon is actually happening at the farm. Farming and the industrialized type of farming that's in particularly used in the United States is incredibly bad for for CO2 emissions. It actually takes CO2 out of the soil, and releases it into the air. And we've basically been doing that since the 1880s. Farming previous to that didn't really add carbon to the air or take it away. It was just kind of the static kind of space. And so what I'm very excited by is there's a new set of farming called regenerative agriculture. And Regen Ag has a number of practices that are very well kind of scientifically backed. They're called no-till and cover crops and these different kind of practices. And at scale, they basically take carbon back out of the air and put it back in the soil. And there is the potential to basically have, a box of cereal, when that is leaving, the oats and the corn for that box of cereal is leaving the farm gate, that corn could be carbon negative. Actually, it's like in a carbon, like there's less carbon being used to produce it than to produce it. And so you could have a situation where you actually have completely guilt-free food on your shelves where there's like no net carbon produced at all for that box of cereal, for that burger, whatever it may be. And so that's what I'm working on, surfacing the data needed to actually make the better decisions to get to that kind of reality. And yeah, it's exciting. The first product and pilot is about to go out in the new year in Germany with a large agribusiness. I can't say who it is, unfortunately, until after the pilot. But I wish I could. And then it's a big company. And then, on the basis of that, we're using chatbots aimed at farmers to collect data. And then we're using satellite imagery to verify what the farmer says by looking at the farm, and then combining those data sets to then tell the farmer the next best, lowest carbon choice that they should make.
That's interesting. Are you using Dialogflow for the chatbots?
The Twilio is the underlying API, Twilio. Yeah. Twilio is an interesting company, but I like them a lot. Don't get me wrong, but yeah.
Yeah. Well, there's so many out there too, but Twilio is one of the bigger ones. And I was just curious because I looked into chatbots a lot myself. It's one of the things too where it made me think, what part of the change did you start? But it seems like for that particular case, it's started from the farm. But there's other cases too, like with smart cities. Do you build new cities or do you revamp old ones, or both? How do you get that going? So it's just interesting, like thinking about which end do you need to start in too.
Yeah,
what's such big problems?
In this case, I started where most of the carbon was sitting. And cities are an interesting kind of like take on that, because it's quite hard to build a new city. Like I know there's a lot of cool projects out there where people are gonna build this brand new city. I think there's a couple projects in sub-Saharan Africa. I know Costa Rica is talking about adding like a city, and there's a few in the United States. And actually, even Ireland was talking about having a city for Hong Kong dissidents. But it's hard with it's just, actually, I'd love to get your view on this. So as people talk, a lot of the drive to start new cities is driven by libertarian ideas about like a more free place, but nearly by definition, like a new city is centrally planned in some way. And so what are your thoughts on this conflict between designing a city from the top down, even if you're trying to implement a kind of freer version of reality in the city itself?
Well, I think the first thing that comes to mind are oceanic seasteads. So a lot of people are trying to escape the more oppressive government, like libertarians trying to be more liberal in a way. And it's one of those things too that it is a complex situation. And depending on what you're trying to build, whether it's inland or on sea, or perhaps just in a completely new country as well, you have laws already set in stone. That's why seasteads are such a big thing, because this is slightly outside the country. I think that laws had to be obeyed in that case, because in order to have that smart city be effective, you have to find people who are following those systems. Because there's plenty of people. There's actually a video game on it called Brink, where there was a smart city that was built, but then there was these kind of dissidents outside of it that weren't actually able to get in, and so it was just kind of the elite in the city, and so there was a big war that broke out between them. And I don't care about the game per se, but it's a very interesting concept of like, hey, if the city is not followed to the fullest extent, then let's find out what areas need to be filled back or kind of fixed or something like that.
Interesting. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. I think actually Cyberpunk, the new game that just came out recently, had something similar or that, where the guy that built the city envisioned it to be like a utopia or some smart city, new city. And then it eventually pretty quickly became a very crime-ridden city. So that might be interesting.
It's interesting you mentioned Cyberpunk. Are you familiar with Solarpunk?
That sounds familiar.
Yeah, so Solarpunk is like this new, one of the things in the climate community, I guess, that we talk a lot about is the lack of like positive like ideas of the future, right? Like it's all dystopic hellscapes that we're trying to avoid. But like it's also really important we build like this positive view. And honestly, like the world, like if the world went the way I think it should go, like it's a way better world than today. Like you don't have any smog, like cars are silent, like you have all these kind of really positive elements. And Solarpunk is one of the attempts to kind of visualize what that future world would look like. And so people should Google it, and some images will pop up.
Well, yeah, I just did just now, and it reminds me of greening cities. There's a course I took on Coursera, for example, there's greening cities and circular economies and that kind of thing, and just being able to have those vertical gardens on the buildings, that kind of thing.
Absolutely, and it's basically this merging of like nature and urban dense spaces, and having those two things kind of intersect in various ways. I think the I'm sure you know this better than I do, but in Barcelona, the super squares, the super blocks that they're building, where they basically have taken, a couple city blocks and they've removed they've pedestrianized them in essence. And so you now have these areas of Barcelona, which is already a very kind of pedestrian friendly city, where there's just no cars allowed except between like 5 a.m. and 8 a.m. to delivery trucks and so on. And it's completely revitalized certain parts of that city.
Yeah, definitely Barcelona is a leading example for smart cities. So surprisingly, Singapore had a very little like recycling or sustainability endeavors that was surprised me there, but they definitely did a lot as well. Epcot, Walt Disney's original vision for Epcot was a very good example too.
Yeah, I don't know too much about that other than my Men in Black. They were in Epcot, but I can't remember too much. So.
Oh, I don't know. I think that might have been the Disney World one because they made the Disney World Epcot, which is kind of like, Tomorrowland and futuristic stuff. But there was original concept where he made it like a smart city back in like the early 1900s, and he was designing this circular city that had all the trucks and all that stuff below, but above ground was like pedestrian based and whatnot.
Fascinating. Yeah, I'll check it out.
Yeah. And so something I ask all my guests is, what is a polymath to you?
Yeah, it's interesting. Honestly, like it's not a term like I probably use in every day. And so I had a quick think about this, after we kind of started communicating, and I guess, I probably turned to like the classic modern polymath, which is Tim Ferriss. I was a big proponent of him back in the day, but I probably keep an eye on him less these days. What I like in particular about his approach is that you don't have to be number one in the world to be like incredibly talented in a space. Like just getting the top 20% in your field, sounds like not that hard, or less difficult. But you're already in the top 20%, and if you get to the top 20% in 3 fields, all of a sudden you're doing something pretty interesting, and especially if those 3 fields are somewhat independent of each other. And so to me, it's like, can you get to that kind of level? Again, you don't have to be number one. Maybe you are like way better in one of them. I know I listened to one of your podcasts earlier today, and somebody was talking about like the T-shape, where you go broad in general, and then you have like depth in one particular area. I think all of these are really interesting models. And in general, I think though it's an attitudinal change that drives a lot of this. And then people can learn and be curious and figure out the specific things that they want to increase their skills in. But also to just realize you don't have to be number one. You can just be, better than, 80 people in a room of 100 kind of thing.
I love asking the question because every time I get an awesome answer that I don't expect. And Tim Ferriss has a great resource called the Specialized Generalist. It's a video he made that talks about kind of that same idea where, again, it's like that T-shaped kind of person where you can be very wide-ranging, but you have that specialty. And something you mentioned there's you don't have to be number one to be a specialist. You have to just be well knowledgeable in that area. And it is very interesting. Sometimes even top 40% can make a big difference. And one thing you mentioned there is the different areas, not just similar areas, but being specialized in different areas. And the innovations that can come from that are very interesting.
Absolutely. And, it's something I talk to my wife a fair amount. Imposter syndrome is very real, and it's often a pretty gendered element. I think we all suffer to a certain extent, but it's particularly in our society. I think it's like, I suppose speaking for myself as a man, like it's easier for me to feel knowledgeable about something probably than my wife does. And I think that's part of it as well. It's like, you can start teaching somebody once you get to that top 20%. And some people are worried like, oh, can I even teach people? It's like, no, you just have to be more knowledgeable than the person next to you. And that's sufficient to start being a teacher and start being somebody who, can use your knowledge in different ways.
Well, it brings back Pareto's principle, the 80-20 rule. And on top of that, I don't remember what this movie's called. I always bring it up, but I always forget the name. But this guy would basically fall into different positions when he's running away from the cops or FBI. And so he's going across the country, running away from the authorities. And at one point, he becomes a professor. And he teaches these students by just reading a chapter ahead. And so the day that the class comes, he just starts repeating what he learned like the night before or something like that.
That's really interesting. That reminds me of like when I would like train new salespeople at like previous companies that I was involved in. I would always say to them, it's like your general job as a salesperson, especially if you're talking to very highly technically smart people, I was selling, data to quantitative hedge funds like mathematicians, physicists, and all this kind of thing. You just need to try to be smart for the first 3 minutes. And then you just let the material and everything kind of speak for itself. And then after a while, you can be smart for 4 minutes, and then 5 minutes, and then 6 minutes. Like you don't have to go, toe to toe with a physicist about physics for like hours. Like there's never going to be a situation where you're in like doing that. But if you can like sound knowledgeable and like be on the same page just for a couple of minutes, that's sufficient. And I think
it's the hook.
Exactly. You're just trying to get that hook, just trying to get that connection that you're both at a similar level, and then you can kind of like get into the sale itself.
Yeah, it reminds me of Bill Gates, which I know a lot of people have wild different opinions on him, but I think it's really interesting how he goes out of his way to learn many different areas deeply. And so he'll have like a panel of experts when he's trying to solve a problem, and he'll go to toe with them for a short time, but he knows that he doesn't know as much as them. Like they're obviously specialists in those fields, but he'll go toe to toe in multiple different fields, all in one kind of Socratic setting, which is interesting.
Yeah, those kind of scenarios are interesting. I mean, in my current kind of project that I'm working on, I've talked to a lot of soil academics, right, to try to get better understanding of how to measure soil carbon and so on. And these people clearly know infinitely more than I know. But it's interesting, like what many of them lack is the ability to kind of figure out how to commercialize some of the kind of measurement techniques. And so I'll talk to somebody and like they're like, oh, we're actually working on this invention that's going to make soil carbon measurement so much easier. And I'm like, oh, that's amazing. Like, when's it going to be out? And they're like 2027. I'm like, I need it in 3 months. It's like, how can we do this so that, because I'm like, if you don't have it in 3 months, I need to go build it. Even if it's not going to be as good as what you build, like I just need to figure out a way to build it, or I have to find some other company that's also moving on that kind of time frame. And so I think like, the power of expertise is really powerful, but when it's combined with velocity, that's when you get really interesting things, right? Like if people can make decisions quickly, people can convert their knowledge into action pretty quickly. That's when I'm very excited by like the kind of knowledge people bring.
Well, and it's interesting too, because I think it's the business acumen in you as well, where you have that business knowledge, a skill combined with your plant and agriculture knowledge. And so you're finding an intersection between those two. How can you market that particular area? But if you were coming from maybe a academic standpoint, you may be like, how can I document this or make it into a book, that kind of thing.
And I think and I won't put myself in those echelons, I haven't proven it too much yet, but I think great founders are great, like people who can synthesize lots of different concepts in new ways. Like in a particular example, I'm talking to this large agribusiness as part of this pilot, and I just mentioned like a data model that, like it's just a way of arranging data that like we've been using in fintech for 10 years. And they were just like blown away. They were like, "Oh my Lord! Like this is going to change everything." And like I didn't even, like I barely mentioned it because like it's just so ingrained that like it's just a way you do certain things. And I think like that's a really powerful way, especially when people want to get involved in areas that they're less familiar with, whether it's climate or people want to do something more impactful in the medical field or as part of COVID supply chains. Like as people move into these other spaces, like the fact that they don't know anything about the space sometimes is actually an advantage because, as long as you're coming into it, that curiosity and that ability to synthesize your previous knowledge, you can come in and be like, oh, well, why do you do it that way? You should just do it this other way. And, that we've been doing in this other industry.
The beginner's mind.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, and that's one thing I was going to mention too. Another common thing about polymathic people like yourself is that you're able to synthesize different areas and create synergy between them. And that's what I think is really key. And that's what I was trying to exemplify for you there.
Yeah. And at least we try, right? It doesn't always work, but.
So a few more questions before we end up wrapping up here, but something you mentioned on one of your profiles is that the advice you would give to your younger self is to be riskier. So how can one take more risks in life?
This goes back to the Maslow's piece. Like I can be riskier because again, I'm already kind of fortunate across different things. If you don't know where you're literally going to eat tomorrow, don't be risky, right? Like figure out where you're going to eat.
Yeah.
Having said that, though, there is a certain type of cultural norm, particularly prevalent in European countries, particularly prevalent in Ireland, which punishes ambition of a certain type. And even though I partly grew up in the United States for a couple of years when we were very young, I was a little bit more resistant to that mentality. And so I was known as quite an arrogant Irishman back in the day as a teenager. Despite that, it still was in me a little bit that, can I really do this? Right? Like, there are other people out there smarter, better than me, all those kind of things, imposter syndrome, all those kind of things. And the big thing that I've, I suppose, learned, if I look back at my career, it's kind of shocking to me that I was at the same company for 8 years. Like that is like relative to the last 18 months, even, and how I act, as in my mid 30s compared to how kind of stayed and following a specific rule book I was in my mid 20s. It's kind of remarkable to me. And so, the message I would give myself is take more risks. And the main risk taking, I would say, is like, you don't have to go and try heroin or anything. It's more, think about the reasons you're doing specific things and how much of these are cultural pressures that may not have a lot of basis. And so, travel is a great example. Like a lot of Americans in particular, like don't travel as much like internationally as Europeans, for example. And so, if you do have the economic means to travel, like go travel, like it's super, super valuable in many different ways. and the other aspect is like just starting companies. And so, when Hale didn't go where that company I mentioned earlier with my brother, when that didn't go where we wanted to, I was in a bit of debt. Like I had a little bit of a cushion for a while, and then that was all gone. And, I started being a little bit more kind of risk averse. I was like, okay, I need to get a job and I need to like get our finances to a certain point. And my wife and I were like talking all this stuff all the time. And this year, I was planning to quit my previous company and start something in 2021, and then COVID hit. And my wife and I, we sat down and it's like, oh, we should be taking the big risks now. Like this is an amazing opportunity to actually do something. The world is flattened. Everybody's a Zoom call away now. If you want to get investors, like you don't have to fly into Silicon Valley anymore. You can just like get a Zoom call. And so there's all these elements that are flattened. And we're just like, what's our worst case scenario? Not the literal worst case scenario. Of course, we get a disease and healthcare and all those kind of things. But our kind of worst case scenario is like, because she also started something at the same time. So we work on our things and they fail and we just go get a job. And that's just everybody else's like normal case scenario. And so it's like, well, let's just go do it. And then like our worst case scenario. And again, we're coming from a very, very privileged point of view. We've always had good jobs. We've got a good resume if that's important. But I think that's it. And it's like, and through that kind of risk taking, I try to evangelize, like take that chance. And if you surround yourself by people who do take those kind of chances, and you have to mitigate your risks where you can, I think you will, in general, have a better kind of well-lived life.
Well, and as Tim Ferriss often puts it too, risk isn't as scary as it sounds usually too. It doesn't have to even be that high of a risk. Sometimes it's just being a risk of embarrassment or something like that. Maybe you have to go live with your parents or something like that for a couple of years because you have to build up your savings to move back out for college kids or something like that. And it makes me think too, just the opportunistic aspect. Sometimes you just need to take opportunities. Like you and I both have pursued my podcast and your podcast this year. And it was one of those things where I always wanted to do interviews, but I didn't know how per se to get started on that. Matchmaker.fm literally landed on right in front of me, like at the end of April, beginning of May, something like that. And now since then you're like my 77th guest.
Congrats.
And it's just insane how, thank you, there's just so much opportunity in case.
Yeah. And like even how I kind of thought about the podcast when I was starting it was like, how can I get this up and running as quickly as possible? Because I know like the big fear with a lot of projects and podcasts and blogs and similar things in particular, people start and stop very quickly. Like they'll get to 2 episodes and whatever. And so I went into it and I was like, don't spend too much time on any one piece. And all you have to do is try and get stuff out. And so I got those first 2 guests through outbound LinkedIn messages. And actually that's still the primary way we get guests. And through that, we got those first 2 guests and we recorded them. And like, I'm Greg and John, the first 2 guests, I'm internally kind of grateful to both of them. I've sent them many emails thanking them ever since because it was just a proof. Like I didn't buy anything. We just used Zoom just to test it because I really just wanted to prove myself that I would do it twice in a row. Once we did it twice in a row, it was easy to just continue after that. And I think that's the key. It's just you got to start. And don't do your plan of your next 62 episodes when you haven't done 2. Just get to those first 2 episodes done, and then get the next 2 and the next 2, and like don't overpromise.
Yeah, well, I definitely have experienced that myself, but a lot of content creators talk about just do like 100 episodes. Like, don't worry about quality per se until you just get 100 pieces of content out there, because quality will come with quantity and experience and all that good stuff. And even my first guest, Dale Brockta, like he didn't necessarily believe in polymath. I think we actually had a debate basically on whether or not it was a good thing to be or not. But it was just interesting how he took the opportunity and we were able to just get started, and that was that start.
Yeah, absolutely. And you get better and worse over like with some of these things. Like sometimes I feel like I'm getting really good at certain aspects of something, whether it's the podcast or something else, and then like you get confronted by a big failure, and like those are super exciting, right? It's terrible in the day, like you have just like a bad day, and then you're like, oh, this is a bad day, and then the next day you're just like, oh, that's so great. It's like, oh, I thought I was at an 8 out of 10, and I was at a 4 out of 10, and it's like, okay, we got a lot of work to do now. Right.
And so another adventure of yours is the Wine Vagabond Adventures. So what started that?
Yeah, so Wine Vagabond was it's still my Instagram and so on. But I got very kind of passionate about wine it was about a year or 2 before I left New York. So about 2012, 2013. And I don't know. I basically, I'd never really been into, I was an Irish person. We drank all the time, all this kind of thing. But I wasn't really particularly interested in wine. And when I moved to New York, I just started going to wine bars with friends and that. And I was like, oh, this is great. And a couple of years previously, I'd been to Stellenbosch wine region down in South Africa with a few friends, and I just loved it. And this kind of connection between the land and the wine regions are nearly always the most beautiful parts of the world, and the fact that it's still agriculture, like it's still like born of a understanding of nature and soil and all these kind of things. And then also it's associated with the most pleasurable nice restaurants, all that, it's romantic, like all these kind of things. And so it just had this massive appeal. So I just started reading up about it, and I came across these different kind of wine certifications. And so one of them is called CSW. And so I was like, oh, this is interesting. And so I decided I was like, all right, I'm going to do the CSW. And you have to learn a lot about wine to pass this. It's incredibly difficult. And, similar to like just trying to start something, I was like, I was working a full-time job. I was selling those data to quantitative hedge funds in New York. With my visa in the US at the time, I could not have another paid job. Like that was not even allowed. And so I was like, all right, how am I going to do this? So I need to be able to taste lots of wine and talk about wine a lot. And so what I decided to do was offer to work for free as an unpaid intern at retail wine shops in Manhattan. And so I reached out to 4. I sent them an email. I was like, look, this is my situation. I'm studying for my CSW. It's going to happen in January. This is probably about August, September of the previous year. And the only thing, you can't pay me. You legally can't pay me, but I pick my hours. And so if it's only once a week on a Wednesday between 8 and 10 p.m. until you close after I finish my job, so be it. If it's just every second Saturday, and so on. And so 2 replied. I had interviews with 2, and one, it was like a smaller wine shop than I really wanted to work with, and the other was Union Square Wines, which is actually the biggest wine shop in Manhattan. And I ended up working there for 3 months, doing probably on average about 10 hours a week, and it was amazing. Like I was, this is a high-end wine shop. Like I served Rachel Wise at one point, and I was just like a guy on the floor. And they also gave me an 80% discount on any purchases. They gave me a top-end, staff discount. And so I just was able to drink amazing wine. I was able to buy very cheap wine and practice. And at the end of it, pass my exams. And at that point, it's a lot managing to, I was working nights basically. So that was the wine bag. And then I tried to basically start a company, like an agency, converting vineyards to email marketing. It was going to be the actual company concept, which I played around with a couple of months. And then actually I stopped doing that to do hail with my brother.
Well, who knows what it might take you next. It makes me think of Gary Vee too. He talks about, he's been known as the wine guy, of course, but he talks about like working for people for free so you can learn from them and get experience that way. And this, even though you had a full-time job, that's what you did too for the wine.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's, again, something like I drink less wine now because I'm in Mexico right now, and it's more other things. But I definitely do want more tequila and mezcal. But I definitely do want to make wine. So the point that I feel is like the one thing I'm missing out. That doesn't mean I own a vineyard, but you can like buy grapes. You can and be part of a process. And so I'd quite like to do that, but not for the next couple of years.
Maybe when you're 80, you'll have a vineyard.
There you go. Never know. Knocking about. Live the dream.
Yeah. What's next for you, James?
What's next? So I'm hoping to move back to New York actually next year. So in 2021, and there's a number of different reasons why, but in essence, I want to be like back in like a bigger, more energetic city. My wife's from New York and so on, and so that's the next in terms of personal life. It's just easier to see my family in Ireland than that from New York relative to Mexico as well. And then it's just all about getting the company to a certain level. We'll probably take on some funding next year. I'm already talking to a couple of investors who are pretty excited. And so in essence, I'm just looking to close that first pilot, get some recurring revenue, raise some money. I'm still stealth on LinkedIn, and that's not to be special or anything, but it's just like I don't really have a product yet. So, but I'm going to try to have something kind of physical or like visual that you can see over the holidays, and then launch. And so 2021, this time next year, if I still have the podcast going, that'd be amazing. I'd be probably on episode like 70 at that point, which would be great because it's weekly. And the company funded with a couple of employees, and we're like properly working on decarbonizing food. That would be just phenomenal.
Yeah, that's amazing. And so where can people find you online, James?
Yeah, I suppose the best place is James _McWalter on Twitter. That's my kind of primary MC Walter. You can also, if you're interested in the podcast, so Carbotnic, Carbotnic.com. That's my podcast. And then JamesMcWalter.com is just my personal website if people want to reach out that way as well.
I have links down in the description, so we're not too worried, but I just want to make sure we have that verbal confirmation. What could be the call to action for the audience today?
Yeah, I think the big call to action, and I'll put on my kind of climate evangelist hat again, is, have a real think about, are you doing the things every day that you really want to be doing? People have such a power, like an ability to cause impact, and you don't have to be a founder, you don't have to be somebody at the cutting edge of some sort of technology, but really just think, it's like, are you having the impact that you personally want to have in the world? And just ask that question. And then if you don't like the answer, just pick a date to make a decision on that. And again, that could be 5 years from now, that could be 1 year from now, it can be 1 month from now. But ask yourself, are you having the impact you want? And then if you're not, pick a date to decide what to do about that. And that's my main call to action. And I think a lot can come from just picking a date to do something, even if it's small, and you can kind of go from there.
It's one of the big bases of atomic habits, actually, is like setting stone a date and time to focus on something. So
absolutely.
Good. Thank you. And so once again, this is Dustin Miller and James McWalter on the Polymath Podcast.
Thanks everybody.